Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Issei becomes Annihilation Maker. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The bell for lunch at Kuoh Acade was a shrill testament to enforced normalcy. In a world secretly balanced on a triad of devils, angels, and fallen angels, the school's pristine order was a beautiful lie. Kazuki Sato, sitting alone under a sakura tree in the courtyard, appreciated the irony. He was a walking crack in that facade, a secret far denser than any devil's. He had been reincarnated. Memories of a past life, a dull cycle of spreadsheets and quiet desperation had crashed into him 5 years ago, a psychic tidal wave that also shattered the seal on the power within his soul. He had awoken not just to a second chance, but to a terrifying, glorious birthright, the Longinus-class sacred gear, Annihilation Maker. The power to create any being, limited only by the depth of his magic and the breadth of his imagination. It was a godlike ability, and his first years were spent in terrified, clandestine experimentation, forging mindless, instinctual constructs in hidden forests that dissolved into motes of light when his energy ran out. He had learned control, de-escalation, and a fundamental philosophy: boundless power required boundless will. He was sketching in a notebook, not designs but complex magical theory matrices, when he felt the familiar, oppressive pressure. It swept across the courtyard like a silent wave, sending a chill through the mundane students who hurried away, unaware of why they felt suddenly anxious. Rias Gremory, the crimson-haired princess of the school and the underworld, rounded the corner with the grace of a born sovereign. Beside her, Akino Himejima, her queen, moved with a gentle smile that concealed careful assessment. Their eyes, however, were fixed not on Kazuki, but on the space beside him. Kazuki did not look up from his notebook and remarked that they were disrupting the sunlight. Ria stepped forward and informed him that he was harboring an unregistered entity of considerable power. She was looking at Celine, who stood silently a step behind Kazuki's seated form. Celine, his first and only creation thus far, presented a humanoid silhouette of measured elegance and quiet strength, clad in a professional-style outfit, hair pulled into a ponytail, and eyes the color of amethyst behind thin-framed glasses. She gave off a dense, alien magical signature. Kazuki closed his book and stood, and Celine mirrored his movements seamlessly. He explained that Celine had not appeared independently but had been created by him and was an extension of his own will and magic, therefore not requiring registration as a separate entity. Akino's sweet smile tightened as she noted that creating such a stable, powerful familiar was not a simple feat for a human. Kazuki shrugged and described himself as a simple man with a complicated sacred gear, then said they should be allowed to go, since lunch was fleeting. Rias took a step forward, her gaze intense, and told him that the energy she had felt earlier was extraordinary. She emphasized that creating life, or a semblance of it, was a power of the highest order and explained that the underworld had structures to help manage such gifts. Kazuki cut in with a dry, sardonic observation that she might as well be offering him employment benefits joked about as including immortality, social standing, and lifelong service to a noble house. Rias, slightly taken aback, clarified that she meant family, protection, and purpose, and then offered him a place in her peerage, an unprecedented offering of 2 rook pieces for a human. The offer weighed on Kazuki. He acknowledged that in another life he might have accepted the security and belonging, but the memory of being a cog in a corporate machine rose up like bile. He considered such an arrangement a gilded cage and felt it would betray the creative freedom his power represented. He refused the offer, stating that his purpose was his own to define and that his power, while raw, was untainted. Rias shifted from persuasion to regal disappointment and warned him that the supernatural world was not kind to lone wolves, no matter their strength. She cautioned that he would face threats he could not handle alone. Kazuki replied that he would handle them alone and turned to leave, Celine moving as his shadow. Akino called after him with a sharp edge to her voice, explaining that Sona Citri would likely approach him as well and offer a more strategic partnership. Kazuki replied that he did not play chess and that he invented new games. He and Celine disappeared around the corner of the main building, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Rias watched them go, brows furrowed with unresolved fascination, and instructed Akino to investigate everything about Kazuki Sato and to monitor his creation. She noted that Celine's power signature matched nothing in their records and admitted a spark of competitive interest that he refused to be a piece, but that everyone was a piece in some game he simply did not realize he was already on the board. The library of Kuoh Acade was Sona Citri's second throne room. Silence was her scepter, order her crown. The next day, when Kazuki entered seeking a specific, obscure text on European magical convergence points, he found Sona waiting at his usual isolated corral. The petite, blue-haired devil sat with perfect posture and had a chessboard set before her, the pieces arranged for a new game. Tsubaki Shinra, Sona's queen, stood nearby as a gentle but watchful presence. The atmosphere differed from Rias's dramatic pressure. It was cool, quiet, and intellectually demanding. Sona anticipated his research needs and placed the very book he sought beside the board, explaining that it came from her personal collection and was more comprehensive than the school's copy. Kazuki inclined his head and asked to borrow it. Sona proposed a match. Chess, she explained, was an excellent metaphor for the supernatural world, where pieces had defined roles unlocked by strategy and the vision of the player. She offered the book as a prize if Kazuki won. The book would be his indefinitely, and her peerage would provide any scholarly assistance he required. If she won, Kazuki would agree to a formal consultation session to discuss how his talents might align with the strategic stability of Kuoh Town. It was a clever, measured offer, less emotional than Rias's familial pull, more intellectual, and entirely in keeping with Sona's orderly approach. It appealed to reason, to mutual benefit. It was also, Kazuki saw immediately, another trap. Consultation would lead to obligation, to a de facto allegiance. Kazuki reminded them that he had told Gremory he did not play chess, then pulled out the chair opposite Sona and sat without touching the board. Sona argued that everyone played, whether they admitted it or not, and that his presence and power made him a piece. She asked whether his player was himself or chaos. Kazuki smiled faintly and reached out, but instead of moving a pawn he placed his hand on the board beside it. Dark, shimmering energy seeped from his palm, coalesced and writhed, and within moments a miniature queen formed on the board. It was not a standard piece but a tiny, exquisitely detailed figurine of Celine, arms crossed and face set in a regal glare, made of solidified shadow that hummed with a faint magical aura. Sona and Tsubaki stared, utterly captivated and unnerved by the casual, immense display of creative control. Kazuki told President Citri that he did not play with their pieces. He explained that he made his own, defining their rules, capabilities, and loyalty. Their game was two-dimensional and bound by a checkered pattern. His was multidimensional, bound only by his imagination and his magic. He stood, took the book, and allowed the Shadow Queen to dissolve into smoke. He promised to return the book when he was done and gave his word as a resident that he would not be the one to disrupt the stability of Kuoh Town. He also made clear that he would not be drafted into their army to police it and that his allegiance belonged to his own vision. Then he walked away. Sona was left staring at the now ordinary chessboard, her strategic mind completely recalibrating. He had not merely declined her game. He had demonstrated that he was playing an entirely different one. Tsubaki murmured the word president in a quiet, stunned tone. Sona adjusted her glasses and acknowledged that she now understood Rias's frustration. She observed that he was not just a powerful piece but a player who had brought his own board, and they had no idea what the rules were. The tension at Kuoh Acade grew thicker over the following week. Rias Gremory's occult research club watched Kazuki with a mix of suspicion and fascination. He ignored them, spending his time with Celine in a secluded, warded corner of the school grounds he used as his workshop. His magic reserves had replenished and strengthened through constant exercise. He prepared a second creation, not a traditional knight but a swift, relentless enforcer shaped by concepts of motion, rupture, and pursuit. The form that emerged from his annihilative magic was a humanoid warrior, fierce and dynamic, with wild crimson hair tied in a high tail, fiery gold eyes, and dark combat gear built for speed and power. He named her Scat-Hack after the legendary tutor. Scat-Hack knelt, grinning, and told Kazuki that he should point her at his enemies. Before he could answer, a new, aggressively brash presence swept across the grounds. The wards he and Celine had set shimmered but held. Moments later, a blond man in a flamboyant white suit strolled into view, followed by a group of smirking devils. Riser Phoenix and his peerage had arrived for the scheduled raiding game against Rias. Riser looked Kazuki over dismissively and then regarded Celine and Scat-Hack with an assessing gaze, telling them that Rias's territory contained unclaimed treasures and that such familiars were too fine for a human. He offered to take them, claiming they would make fine additions to his collection. Scat-Hack snarled and stepped forward, her fists crackling with kinetic energy. Celine put a steadying hand on her shoulder, her amethyst eyes flat and controlled. Kazuki, appearing bored, told Riser to back off and that he was interrupting. Riser's expression darkened in response and he accused Kazuki of insolence. The confrontation was cut short by the arrival of Rias and her entire peerage, faces tense and determined. Rias told Riser that his business was with her and not with the students. Riser smirked and recovered his composure. He proposed a bargain to Kazuki, serve him in the upcoming raiding game and help him crush Rias, and he would be granted a low position in his peerage, an offer presented as more than a human usually received. Kazuki looked from Riser to Rias and saw the hope and desperation in her expression. He could tell she wanted him to intervene, to be her unexpected advantage. He decided otherwise. Kazuki told Riser that he had no interest in their internal squabbles, and he informed Rias that he did not join teams and that her engagement dispute was her problem to resolve on her own. Rias's features registered deep hurt and betrayal. Kiba frowned, Issei looked shocked, and Akino's smile vanished, replaced by a colder demeanor. Rias asked him whether he would allow this to happen and whether he would stand aside despite having the power to help. Kazuki replied that he had the power to mind his own business. He explained that his power was not a tool for political convenience and challenged Rias to prove her own worth rather than relying on pawns she had not earned. He turned and walked away, with Celine and Scat-Hack falling into formation behind him. He told them that the atmosphere there had become toxic with entitlement and poor choices. As he left, the divide between him and the Occult Research Club became deep and lasting. He had drawn a line for his own freedom and left them on the other side. What had been disagreement had hardened into a cold, principled schism. The fallout from the Rogue God incident reshaped the supernatural landscape of Kuoh. The Occult Research Club's disdain was now tinged with a wary, grudging respect. Sona Citri sent a formal, impersonal note acknowledging the efficient resolution of the threat, a massive concession. The real consequence was attention from higher, darker places. Weeks later, a new menace descended. Not a god, but a dragon, a rogue dragon, an ancient class beast driven mad by isolation or injury. It was a creature of pure, bestial destruction, with scales like black diamonds and breath that corrupted the land. It descended on a mountainside forest outside Kuoh, and its mere presence began poisoning the ley lines. For the first time, the Occult Research Club and the Citri Group combined forces, a historic alliance. Even together, they were on the back foot. Rias's power of destruction bounced off its scales. Sona's water prisons evaporated. Kaniko's strength proved ineffective. Issei's boosted punches barely chipped a scale. The dragon behaved like a natural disaster, not a foe for structured peerage warfare. From a cliff overlooking the battle, Kazuki observed with his 4 servants. He had recently created Verna, a rook of immense physical defense and earth-shaking power, bronze-skinned with stoic amber eyes. Scat-Hack watched the battlefield with an eager edge to her demeanor. Lydia reported the technical status with calm precision and Celine remained silent, awaiting orders. Scat-Hack noted that they were losing and seemed almost eager for action. Lydia calmly reported that the dragon's corruption would reach the city's water table in approximately 2 hours. Celine waited for Kazuki's command. Kazuki watched Rias, battered and desperate, rally her peerage for a suicidal combined attack. He watched Sona, glasses cracked, trying to formulate a new plan. He watched Issei throw himself at the beast to protect a fallen Yudo. He felt no personal attachment to their plight, but the dragon was a blight on the order he had been building and it threatened his sanctuary. Kazuki announced a new tactic. He reasoned that this was not about killing a beast but about erasing a concept. He ordered Celine to coordinate the team. Lydia was instructed not to defend but to unmake the dragon's corrupted energy field. Skathak was told not to strike the dragon's body but to strike the kinetic energy around it, creating vacuums to disrupt its movement and breath. Verna was to avoid merely tanking blows and instead shatter the ground beneath it to destabilize its foundation. He raised his hand, his Annihilation Maker glowing with a terrifying light, and stated that he would provide the catalyst. He poured his magic out, not to create a standalone monster, but to weave a single, colossal construct, a spectral, miles-long cannon of arcane energy, its design a fusion of magic and physics born of his reincarnated mind. It did not fire a conventional projectile or beam. It fired a concentrated packet of nullification. He ordered execution. His servants moved with precision. Lydia's green magic washed over the dragon not as a barrier but as an eraser, stripping away the corrosive aura. Skathak became a storm of implosions, causing the dragon's head to snap back as the air around its maw collapsed. Verna stomped the earth and the mountain trembled, great fissures opening under the dragon's claws. The dragon, confused and enraged, reared up and gathered its most powerful breath. Kazuki's cannon fired. A silent, shimmering shell of energy struck the dragon's center mass. There was no explosion. Instead, a wave of absolute nothingness radiated from the point of impact. Where it passed, the dragon's scales did not break. They simply ceased to be. Flesh, bone, and the malignant force animating it unraveled into non-existence from the inside out. In 5 seconds, the colossal rogue dragon was gone. Not a corpse, not ash. Simply gone, as if it had never existed. The corrupted land healed quickly, the ley lines flowing clean once more. The combined peerages stood in a field of shattered trees and exhaustion, staring at the empty space where annihilation had just occurred. Kazuki descended the cliff with his servants flanking him. He walked past the stunned devils and paused before Rias and Sona. Rias looked up at him with her pride broken, saved by the person who had refused her help when she needed it most, and asked why, confusion and hurt in her expression. Kazuki explained that he did not fight their battles and that he maintained his world. He removed the dragon because it was a stain. He clarified that their politics, engagements, and raiding games were irrelevant to him. He made his stance clear to the gathered devils, the Occult Research Club, the Student Council, and their servants. He declared that he was not a stray piece nor a rival king but the architect, and that the town was under his protection by his own choice rather than by anyone else's authority. He stated that he would not be chained by them, but he would not tolerate wanton chaos. Rogue gods, stray dragons, or any force that brought disorder would be annihilated. They might govern their underworld politics, but the safety of this territory and the right to exist in peace were now his domain. He turned and walked away, his 4 imposing servants, his queen, his knight, his bishop, and his rook following without a backward glance. He had drawn his line not just in sand but in the erased remains of a dragon. He was free. He was sovereign. Kuoh, whether they liked it or not, now had a new, utterly independent, and formidable guardian. The balance of power had changed. The fallout from the dragon's obliteration was not immediate. It settled over Kuoh Academy like a slow, chilling pressure. Human students continued their lives of gossip and study oblivious to the supernatural currents, but the 2 devil factions felt the atmosphere shift tectonically. Rias Gremory oscillated between simmering anger and grudging awe. Kazuki Sato, according to the school registry a painfully ordinary name for such an entity, had demonstrated power that dwarfed her peerage's coordinated effort against Riser and had done so with clinical efficiency that unsettled many. He had made a declaration, and devils especially of the pillar houses did not take kindly to declarations from unknowns. Sona Citri sequestered herself with her peerage, poring over every recorded observation of Kazuki and his creations. the data was frustratingly sparse. The servants displayed abilities that broke conventional devil class categorization. A knight who manipulated kinetic concepts, a bishop with multi-layered instantaneous barriers, a rook with world-shaking physicality, and a queen with vast manipulative power. Their master, however, registered as human in unsettling paradox. Kazuki maintained an icy normalcy. He attended classes, his strikingly unusual companions serving as a conspicuous, if distracting, buffer. Celine shared his class as a silent, observant presence who answered questions with unnervingly perfect, distant knowledge. Scathach and Verna were seen in club activities, dominating without effort. Life shifted subtly around them, and Kuoh adjusted to the presence of a new, enigmatic protector whose choices would shape the town's future. Lydia frequented the library, devouring texts on everything from quantum physics to classical poetry. They formed a closed circuit, acknowledging no one outside their circle. The attempts by Kaneko to sniff around, or by Gasper to observe from the shadows, were gently but firmly thwarted. A barrier would shimmer, a glance would freeze them in place, or Verna would simply appear, smiling, and ask if they needed something. The message was clear: observe from a distance, do not touch. The tension broke 2 weeks later, not with a roar but with a polite, impossible knock. It came at the door of Kazuki's residence, a traditional, spacious house on the outskirts of town that had seemingly always been there. The knock was 3 precise, resonant taps that seemed to vibrate through the very wood. Kazuki, who had been in his study reviewing a complex magical schematic of Kuoh's ley lines with Celine, went still. His eyes, usually a cool gray, sharpened, and he noted that their visitor was early. Celine's starry eyes flickered as she observed that the Crimson Satan had dispensed with subterfuge. Kazuki instructed Verna to see their guest in without raising his voice. Downstairs, Verna opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man with vibrant crimson hair and gentle eyes, dressed in an impeccable modern black suit. He looked like a kind, handsome young executive, but the power he radiated, so tightly contained it felt like standing at the edge of an event horizon, was unmistakable. The man greeted her warmly, introduced himself as Surzek's Gremory, and explained that he had come to speak with Kazuki Sato if he was available. Verna assessed him. Her cheerful smile did not reach her eyes. She informed him that the master was expecting him and asked him to follow her. She led him not to a formal reception room, but to the study. Surzek took in the room, the schematics floating in holographic light, the books that were not just paper but condensed knowledge, and Kazuki, seated behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single piece of void-dark obsidian. The 4 beauties stood at strategic points around the room. Celine beside Kazuki, Scathach by the window, Lydia near a bookcase, Verna by the door he had just entered. Kazuki addressed him as Lord Surzek without rising, noting that it was an honor and that he had expected Lucifer to send an emissary rather than come in person. Surzek's smile remained as he explained that when his little sister's safety and the stability of a key town were involved, he preferred to handle matters directly. He asked to be called simply Surzek and requested permission to sit. A chair of the same obsidian material manifested from the floor behind him. He raised an eyebrow, impressed by the effortless spatial manipulation, and took the seat. He admitted that Kazuki's creations were astonishing and that he had never seen such constructs before. Kazuki explained that they were his sacred gear, the Annihilation Maker, a tool of creation and unmaking, and that he had refined its application. Surzek leaned forward slightly and observed that to create sentient, autonomous beings of such power and stability went beyond what the gear was recorded as capable of. He then asked directly who Kazuki Sato really was. A reincarnated devil, a descendant of some forgotten lineage, or something else? Kazuki met his gaze and stated that he was human, a reincarnated one whose memories of a past life were intact. He clarified that his soul and species were human and that he possessed a Longinus. That, he said, was the beginning and end of his explanation for his capabilities. The air grew heavier. Surzek did not change his gentle aura, but the weight of his attention did. He listed what Kazuki's actions would look like from the underworld's perspective: a human wielding a Longinus to create a peerage that might rival or surpass that of a high-class devil, attending a school with 2 devil heiresses, refusing to aid one in a matter of familial duty, and publicly declaring a town under his personal protection. He asked Kazuki to see how that appeared to them. Kazuki responded that he saw it perfectly. He told Surzex that from the underworld's view, they saw a rogue element, a potential threat to the balance of power, and a human arrogantly trespassing in devil affairs, perspectives rooted in their system and hierarchy. Kazuki contrasted that with his own perspective, which he said was rooted in preservation. His past life he had understood the fragility of existence, and here he saw the same. Kuoh, he explained, was a nexus where ley lines converged and dimensional boundaries were thin. It attracted threats, such as the rogue dragon that the underworld's monitoring systems had failed to tag. While Rias and Sona played their games of ratings and politics and were reactive, he insisted that he was being proactive. Surzex probed whether Kazuki had appointed himself guardian. Kazuki replied that because he had the power to do so, he had the responsibility. His declaration, he said, was not meant as a challenge to the Gremory or Citri houses but as a statement of fact to any who would listen. The territory was now under a more vigilant watch. He added that his concern for the sisters' activities was limited to whether they amplified the Nexus's attractant properties or interfered with his work. Surzex fell silent for a long moment before asking what Kazuki's work actually entailed. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Kazuki's lips for the first time as he explained that his work was understanding the architecture of this world and ensuring its foundations remained sound. Surzex spent over an hour in the obsidian study. The conversation was a delicate, high-stakes dance. Surzex probed for origins, for allegiances, for weaknesses, while Kazuki parried with cold logic and an unwavering focus on his self-proclaimed mandate. The 4 servants never moved, but their presence was a constant, silent pressure. Surzex observed that Kazuki Sato was an unprecedented variable. His power was real and his control unervingly absolute, something the underworld could not ignore. Kazuki replied that he did not ask to be ignored, only to be left to his task. He insisted he was not a devil seeking favors or chess pieces, and that his peerage was complete and inseparable from his will. Surzex asked what would happen if Kazuki judged a threat required intervention in his sister's affairs. Kazuki answered that he would act to preserve the stability of Kuoh, and if that incidentally aided Rias Gremory, so be it. If it did not, her concerns would be secondary. The statement contained no malice, only dismissive resolve. Surzex nodded slowly. He had taken the measure of the man, arrogant perhaps, but backed by formidable, incomprehensible power and a singular, unshakable purpose. Kazuki was a natural force rather than a political player, and dealing with him required a different paradigm. Surzex agreed, for now, to observe and acknowledged that the title architect was Kazuki's to claim, but he warned that if Kazuki's actions threatened his family or the peace they had built, they would have a very different conversation, one not held across a desk. The threat of overwhelming force from the strongest being in the underworld hung in the air. Skathaka's hand twitched toward her spear and Lydia's glasses flashed as she watched. Kazuki inclined his head in acknowledgement and asked Verna to see their guest out. After Surzex left, the pressure in the room eased by a degree. Celine commented that Surzex was powerful, a being of condensed destruction and a living contradiction. Kazuki returned to his schematics and described Surzex as a concerned brother and a ruler whose threats were conditional. For the moment, he had accepted terms of coexistence, which was all Kazuki required. But the visit had consequences. Even when concealed, Surzex's presence sent ripples through the local supernatural community. For Rias and Sona, the message was clear: the architect was not to be provoked lightly. Pride and disdain were now tempered with a layer of mandated caution. A few days later, that caution was shattered by a brazen new threat. It began with disappearances of low-tier supernatural entities, a will-o-wisp that haunted an old shrine, a benign tsukumagami from a local antique shop, a minor earth dragon that slumbered in the mountains. They vanished without trace, their residual energy signatures severed cleanly. Then murders began. 2 low-class devils from a small, independent peerage passing through the region were found in an alley. They appeared to have been erased as if their forms had collapsed into nothingness, leaving behind only faint, disturbed residue. The same energy signature from the disappearances, but amplified, lingered on the scene. Rias's peerage investigated under Akino's determined leadership. Issei, newly grasping his boosted gear's potential, was eager to prove himself. They tracked the signature to an abandoned factory on the industrial outskirts and found not a person but a thing, an amorphous mass of darkness that constantly pulled in light and matter from its surroundings. It had shifting openings and hollow features that seemed to leak shadowy energy. The investigators recognized it as a malicious, artificial spirit, a cursed phantasm born from countless trapped and consumed lesser entities and grown far beyond its creator's intentions. It was a tear in the world's fabric, a rogue malignancy. Akino moved to strike, and Issei pushed her back to avoid a lash of shadow that disintegrated a steel beam. Akino's holy lightning struck the creature and it shrieked and recoiled, but the wound sealed instantly, absorbing the energy. Akino reported that it was adapting. Kiba's sword flashes were swallowed by the mass, Kaniko's powerful strikes seemed to vanish against an unfathomable depth, and Gasper's time stop only slowed the thing for a heartbeat before it broke free, its chaotic energy disturbing the discipline of the sacred gear. The creature shifted focus toward stronger prey and spread tendrils of shadow that began engulfing the factory. For the first time since the Riser fight, genuine fear gripped Rias's peerage. This was no duel but a spreading hazard of ravenous darkness. Just as a massive tendril swept toward a cornered Issei and Akino, the air changed. Not with cold, but with an absolute imposition of order. Hexagonal panels of golden light, intricate as stained glass, slammed into existence and formed a perfect cage around the creature. The tendril struck the barrier and shattered like brittle glass. Everyone turned to see Kazuki standing on a gantry above, his gray eyes analyzing the phantasm with detached interest. Lydia stood beside him with her hands outstretched, the source of the binding field. Scathach and Verna dropped down to either side of the cage, and Celine materialized beside Kazuto in a swirl of starlight. Rias reacted with a mix of relief and resentment, calling him architect. Kazuki examined the writhing mass and identified it as a cursed phantasm, a crude, unstable construct, likely the failed experiment of a sorcerer drawn to the nexus and allowed to feed unchecked. He said this was the consequence of inadequate oversight. Kiba asked whether it could be destroyed. Kazuki answered that Lydia's containment field was isolating its consumption property and indicated for Verna to act. Verna stepped forward and placed her palms on the concrete floor. With a focused strain that seemed to echo through the earth, she performed a single open palm strike on the foundation. The resulting shockwave traveled through the ground, was focused by her will and Lydia's field, and erupted inside the golden cage. The space within the barriers vibrated at a catastrophic frequency, and the unstable energy of the cursed phantasm could not withstand the harmonized force. The mass imploded in on itself until there was nothing left but empty, stable space within the cage. Lydia lowered her hands and the barriers vanished. Kazuki looked down at Rias and her stunned, shaken peerage and told them that their methods were inadequate for this class of anomaly. They were targeting the symptoms rather than the source. He warned that the creator of the abomination remained at large, then turned to leave. Rias demanded that he wait, anger overriding her caution, insisting that he judge them from on high while holding the power to help. She asserted that this was her territory as well. Kazuki paused and explained that their priorities differed. She treated the town like a domain to defend through pride and contests, while he saw it as a patient requiring constant, precise care. The two views did not align. He ordered his servants to clean up the wounded and then vanished, leaving the occult research club in the ruins of the factory surrounded by the eerie silence his power had left behind. The disdain between them had been etched into the aftermath. The cleanup operation was a somber affair. The incident with the cursed phantasm was a brutal wake-up call for Rias's peerage. They had been outmatched by a mindless, powerful creature. Issei clenched his fists in frustration as his desire to protect clashed with the stark reality of his limitations. Akino kept a brittle smile while she healed Kaniko and Kiba's minor corrosive injuries. They had been saved by the one person who had held them in contempt. Sona arrived with Tsubaki and explained that the architect had identified the creature as a created entity, a sorcerer's experiment. She warned that this changed the nature of the threat. It was not a random incursion but a deliberate, likely panicked attack. Rias replied that the creator was still out there and insisted they had to find the creator before something worse was made or before the architect decided their inadequacy warranted removing them from the equation. Meanwhile, Kazuki was already several steps ahead in his home. In a sub-basement pocket dimension, a vast holographic map of Kuoh and its magical currents floated. Tiny points of light representing the disappearances and the phantasm's appearance formed a pattern. Celine traced the lines and noted that the consumption points followed the minor ley line tributaries, suggesting the creator was using them as a harvesting network to siphon energy and minor spirits. Lydia pulled up a spectral analysis of the dissolved devil's residue and pointed out that the energy signature carried a distinct, repetitive magical fingerprint, as if the creator had not bothered to hide a personal mark. Scathach observed that it could also be desperation, a failed mage reaching for power they could not control. Kazuki studied the converging lines until the pattern pointed to a single nexus, not the main node under the school, but a smaller, corrupted node near the city's oldest sewer system, where negative human emotions and discarded refuse had tainted the magical flow for decades. He said the creator was there, likely crafting a more controlled, more powerful creation, a familiar or a homunculus core infused with consumed energies. Celine described it as a classic path to pseudo-immortality, an effort to anchor a soul to a self-made construct. Kazuki resolved that they would correct the error and assign tasks. Verna and Scathach to accompany him, Lydia to maintain a city-wide dampening field, and Celine to monitor the dimensional borders for any outside attention attracted by the rips in the fabric. Back at the Occult Research Club, Sona's forensics had converged on the same location, the old water treatment plant. She explained that the residual sorrow and stagnation there had warped local mana, making it an ideal site for creation corrupted by negativity. Rias stood, determination hardening her features, and insisted the peerage could not leave the matter to someone else. They had to prove they could protect the town too. They arrived at the decrepit plant to find the air thick with a cloying, oily magic. Binding and consumption sigils were etched on the walls and floors. In the central chamber, a hunched figure in tattered robes chanted over a swirling vortex of stolen energies. At the center pulsed a nascent humanoid form of dark light. The sorcerer, a once human magus whose soul was fraying, cackled as he sensed them, and declared his intent to use a homunculus core to ascend beyond their kind. He unleashed a wave of consuming darkness similar to the force that had created the phantasm. Rias's peerage scattered and employed hit-and-run tactics. Issei boosted and dived in, deflecting tendrils with his enhanced fists. Kiba created dozens of illusionary swords to confuse the attacks. Aquino and Rias combined their power of destruction and holy lightning in a brilliant, desperate blast that punched a hole in the vortex and provoked a furious reaction from the sorcerer. The homunculus core continued to form, drawing power not only from the sorcerer but from the city's negative emotions fed through the corrupted ley line. A skeletal hand began to emerge from the vortex. Sona called out that the construct was too strong and feeding off their conflict as her peerage struggled to maintain a binding circle that kept eroding. When the core pulled itself free, a new voice cut through the chaos. Kazuki walked calmly into the chamber with Verna and Scathach at his side and assessed the flawed design, noting its inefficient energy conversion and structural instability at the soul-anchoring nexus. The sorcerer accused Kazuki of destroying his previous experiment and threatened to force him into the new creation. The homunculus lunged at Kazuki, its touch intended to absorb. Verna stepped forward and intercepted the attack, using her rook durability to absorb the force. The impact cracked the floor around her, but she held the construct fast as its claws scrabbled against her defenses. The sorcerer reacted with shock. Kazuki moved past them as if they were a minor nuisance and focused on the ritual's architect, stating that the sorcerer had damaged the local metaphysical environment and introduced volatile disruptions into the ley line, a violation of the territory's integrity. Scathach advanced and struck not at the sorcerer's body but at the complex web of magical connections tying the man to the homunculus, the vortex, and the ley line. Each precise strike severed a strand of the ritual. With every broken connection, the homunculus weakened and the ritual feedback began destabilizing the sorcerer. Kazuki reached the ritual's core and placed a hand on the corrupted ley line node. His Annihilation Maker flared, not to destroy, but to rewrite. A wave of ordered creative energy pulsed outward, washing over the corruption. The stained sigils and oily darkness were purged and replaced by a clean, silver light. The vortex collapsed inward with a sound like a long, relieved breath. The homunculus, bereft of its power source, went limp in Verna's grip. The sorcerer fell as his magic broke, and he was rendered unconscious by the backlash. Silence returned to the chamber, broken only by the heavy breathing of Rias's peerage as they gathered themselves and surveyed the cleared scene. They stared at the scene, Verna casually dropping the inert homunculus core like a sack of potatoes, Scat-Hack cleaning her spear, and Kazuki, having fixed the magical foundation of the place, dusting off his hands. Kazuki finally looked at Rias and Sona and informed them that the source had been excised and the environmental damage had been repaired to a baseline stable state. He criticized their intervention as well-intentioned but prolonging the conflict and allowing the core to partially form, increasing the cleanup complexity. His critique landed like a cold splash of water on their hard-fought battle. He then turned away and told them not to create more work for him. He and his two servants walked out, leaving the two devil heiresses and their peerages standing amidst the ruins of a battle they felt they had both won and lost. The architect had solved the problem, but in doing so he had made them feel like clumsy children stumbling through a library he alone curated. News of the sorcerer's defeat, sanitized and filtered through official channels, reached the underworld. The report, likely penned by Surzex or his agents, credited the swift and decisive intervention of local forces, a diplomatic phrasing that encompassed both the Gremry-Citri alliance and the enigmatic architect. The message was clear: the situation in Kuoh was being handled, albeit by an unusual configuration. This did not sit well with everyone. The old Satan faction, those who clung to the legacy of the original Satans, saw an opportunity. A human wielding a Longinus with enough power to draw Lucifer's attention and neutralize high-level threats could be a weapon to acquire or a threat to eliminate before he allied fully with the current, reformist regime. An emissary arrived in Kuoh. He did not approach the school or Kazuki's home. He intercepted Kazuki during a rare, solitary walk through a park at dusk. The man was elegant, dressed in an old-fashioned but expensive suit, with eyes that held a cruel, ancient intelligence. The emissary addressed Kazuki by name and presented himself as pleased to meet the famed architect. Kazuki stopped, hands in his pockets, and identified the man as an agent of the faction opposing the current Mao, noting that his energy carried obsolete ideology and resentment. The emissary's smile faltered at the blunt identification, and he admitted that they represented the true strength and tradition of the underworld, that they had watched Kazuki's endeavors, and that he operated outside the bloated bureaucracy. He argued that Kazuki understood strength and order and saw weakness in the current system, the way they coddled half-breeds and played political games. Kazuki asked the emissary to get to the point. The emissary then offered an alliance, formal recognition of Kazuki's territory, resources beyond imagination, access to forbidden knowledge to refine his architecture, and in return the architect's power would be at their disposal when the factions sought to reclaim their birthright. They painted a vision of Kazuki not only as protector of a town but as the chief architect of a newly purified hell. Kazuki looked at the emissary and rejected the offer. He explained that his purpose was to maintain the stability of existing reality, that their so-called purification would bring catastrophic war, dimensional ruptures, and an influx of the very chaos he worked to prevent. He accused them of being arsonists offering him a match. The emissary hardened and challenged him, mocking the idea that a human would reject the true lords of the underworld and taunting him for siding with schoolchildren and the weak Mao. Kazuki affirmed that he sided with stability and ordered them to leave Kuoh and not return. The emissary's power surged, sending out an oppressive aura that made the surrounding air tense. He declared that if Kazuki would not be a tool, he would be taught a lesson, and then launched himself at the human with lethal intent. He never reached Kazuki. A wall appeared between them, not a fragile barrier of light, but a seamless slab of polished black stone, 8 feet tall and 2 feet thick, erupting from the ground. The emissary slammed into it with a thunderous crash, claws skidding on the impossibly hard surface. From behind the wall, Kazuki's voice ordered the emissary to leave. The emissary roared and unleashed a wave of destructive energy that could level structures, but the wall absorbed the blast and a faint ripple passed across its face. Then the wall slid forward like a piston, an unstoppable block of condensed matter. The emissary scrambled back, sending spell after spell, but the wall advanced with single-minded purpose. It herded the furious devil across the park, across a street where cars screeched and drivers stared in confusion, and finally to the town's spiritual boundary. With one final shove, the wall pushed the emissary past the boundary line. Then the wall crumbled into dust that drifted away on the wind. The entire confrontation had lasted less than a minute. There had been no flashy duel, only an immovable object and an irresistible advance, an absurd, almost disdainful demonstration of power. The incident did not go unnoticed. Surzex received a report that made him chuckle in grim admiration. The old Satan faction had been rebuffed not with a pitched battle but with a dismissive, efficient demonstration of creative power. Rias and Sona watched distant security footage of the moving wall and found the display so blatant and almost humorous that it left them speechless. He had not even engaged in a fight, he had simply removed a high-level threat from his territory. The message spread among factions. The architect would not be recruited, bribed, or forced to play by their rules. His disdain for their politics had become an active, defensive principle. He himself was a wall, a neutral, unassailable fact of the landscape. That evening in his study, Celine warned Kazuki that they would not stop and that the old Satan faction would view his rejection as humiliation and send more direct threats. Kazuki replied that they could come and looked at his model of Kuoh's dimensional architecture, explaining that walls could be built in layers and that sometimes the most effective preservation required the precise removal of a rotten load-bearing structure, glancing at Scathach and her shining spear. For the first time, a hint of proactive intent, cold and resolute, colored his words. The protector was prepared to act decisively if the sickness threatened his charge. A tense calm settled over Kuoh. The old Satan faction, stung by the bizarre and very public expulsion of their emissary, were regrouping. Their next move would not be an offer, but an assassination or a large-scale provocation designed to force the architect into a conflict that would either break him or reveal his limits to the world. Surzex, aware of this, increased the subtle surveillance around the town. He walked a tightrope between not openly protecting a human who had insulted a major faction and not allowing his sister's home to become a battleground for a power struggle that could shatter the fragile peace. Within Kuoh Academy, the relationship between Kazuki and the two devil peerages had cooled into armed, watchful neutrality. They no longer tried to engage him directly. They observed, documented, and trained with a new, grim intensity. Encounters with the phantasm and the sorcerer had exposed glaring holes in their coordination and power application. Even Issei's typical bravado had been tempered by focused training sessions with Asia and Kiba as they worked to refine his balance breaker. Kazuki engaged in his own form of calibration. The recent events were data points: the rogue dragon as a natural threat, the cursed phantasm as an unintentional artificial threat, the sorcerer as an intentional internal threat, and the old Satan emissary as an external political threat. Each required a different response protocol. His Annihilation Maker was not merely a weapon but a toolkit for maintaining reality. He stood in his pocket dimension workshop, a space like a fusion of a celestial observatory and an architect's drafting room. Floating schematics of his servants rotated slowly. Kazuki noted that their current configurations were optimized for the threats already encountered, but that escalation was predictable. He assessed that the next strike would likely be a coordinated assault targeting multiple points to stretch their response, or a single overwhelming force designed to test Verna's absolute defense or Lydia's containment limits. Celine listened and asked whether they should adapt the existing templates or create new constructs. Kazuki favored adaptation as more efficient. The core matrices of their existences were stable, and modular protocols could be implemented. He gestured and the schematics shifted. For Verna, he determined that spatial locking capabilities would be enhanced so her strikes would not only impact matter, but also temporarily fix space around an impact point, preventing teleportation, dimensional phasing, or rapid regenerative reconstitution within the affected zone. Verna, polishing a piece of wall she had created as a souvenir, grinned at the idea of bringing opposing forces together in one effect. For Scat-Hack, Kazuki calibrated her spear's conceptual cutting to sever not only physical and magical links but also conceptual ones: luck, fate, and preordained outcomes. If an enemy relied on a supposedly certain technique or destiny-altering artifact, Scat-Hack would be able to interrupt the connection to inevitability. Scat-Hack's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of wielding a blade that could cut through the narrative threads of fate itself. Lydia's barrier protocols were expanded to include reflective and transference properties. She would not only contain attacks but analyze their compositional energy and reflect a purified or inversely aligned counterpart, turning a curse into a counterbalancing force and a wave of destruction into a wave of stabilization. Lydia adjusted her glasses and appreciated the elegance of turning malice back on itself. Celine's cosmic scale manipulations were refined toward local temporal calibration so she could create microtemporal fields that sped up their reactions, slowed specific threats, or trapped offensive magic in localized causal loops until its energy dissipated. Celine bowed slightly at the responsibility of holding such control over causality. This, Kazuki understood, was the true nature of the architect's work: proactive evolution. He programmed his sacred Gearborn companions with ever more refined and esoteric capabilities, turning them into a peerage that operated on the level of universal laws, not merely conventional magic. The calibration was interrupted by a subtle, city-wide tremor in the magical ley lines. It was not an attack but a probe, a delicate, impossibly vast sensory pulse that swept through Kuoh, examining everything. It touched the school, the Citri clubroom, Kazuki's home, and his workshop. The pulse was searching, analyzing, and although it seemed friendly, it was so profoundly powerful it made the hair on the back of Kazuki's neck stand up. Celine's eyes widened as galaxies swirled within them. Kazuki recognized the presence instantly. Ophis, the infinite dragon god, had come to see the quiet place for herself. The pulse condensed to a single point just outside his workshop's dimensional boundary, and a figure appeared in the viewing portal: a small, dark-haired girl in a gothic dress, clutching a snake plushie, her eyes like bottomless pools of silent infinity. Kazuki observed that she regarded him as one who made the noise stop and maintained stability. Ophis conveyed, without obvious malice, that she preferred quiet and noticed that the beings who pursued her tended to cause chaos. She acknowledged the walls Kazuki had acted and expressed a cautious approval that he would keep noise away from her domain. When Kazuki affirmed that maintaining stability was his function, Ophis nodded and indicated she would not make noise there, admiring how his small protections had rendered the area quiet. Her presence faded as the infinite pressure receded like a tide. The workshop fell silent. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but its implications were immense. Ophis, a being who stood outside all factions, had given tacit approval by recognizing the architect's work and deeming it favorable to her desire for quiet. Kazuki processed this revelation. It changed nothing in a literal sense, and it changed everything strategically. It was not an alliance so much as a statement of non-interference from one of the strongest entities in existence. The old Satan faction, Surzex, and others were now operating on a board where one of the fundamental rules had been quietly altered by a small, enigmatic observer. He returned to his schematics and ordered the calibrations to proceed. The parameters of engagement had been clarified. They would be the keepers of the quiet, and any who sought to shatter it would face those prepared to hold it. His 4 powerful, world-altering servants nodded in understanding. They embodied walls, blades, mirrors, and clocks, and their human architect had just received the most forbidding endorsement imaginable. In Kuoh Acade, Rias felt a shiver down her spine, a primal fear she could not fully explain. Sona, reviewing sensor data, found all her instruments briefly flatlined before resetting. They knew something monumental had happened, but the nature of it was beyond their comprehension. High above, in the dimensional gap, the crimson-haired Mouse Urzex let out a slow breath. He noted that even she acknowledged Kazuki, and observed that the board was set, the pieces were moving, and the architect had become the most important fixed point on the map. His gentle smile returned, the smile of a man watching a storm gather around an unshakable mountain. He wondered what Kazuki Sato would build next. The sky above the abandoned industrial district cracked open like shattered glass. Ophis had vanished only minutes earlier, a silent ripple in reality, her infinite presence simply gone. Kazuki felt the absence like a missing limb. She hadn't said goodbye. She never did. The sudden vacuum she left behind was immediately filled with something far worse. A roar that was more pressure than sound slammed into them. The ground buckled. Black flames erupted in a ring around the group, forming a barrier of pure malice. From the center of the inferno rose Issei Dahaka. 3 dragon heads, each larger than a building, crowned a body of obsidian scales that seemed to drink light. 1,000 shadowy arms writhed from his back like a forest of serpents, each tipped with claws trailing corrupting energy. 6 burning crimson eyes fixed on Kazuki with predatory glee. The central head identified itself as the Annihilation Maker and declared that Kazuki's unclaimed power would be consumed to birth 1,000 abominations. Kazuki's heart hammered, but his face remained calm. 3 servants manifested at his side, creations born from his sacred gear's boundless imagination. Vera, a crystalline knight clad in ever-shifting prismatic armor, wielded a blade that refracted reality itself. Kael, the storm weaver, was a lithe figure of crackling lightning and shadow, half cloud and half machine. Lyra, the architect of decay, was a striking woman with obsidian skin and veins of molten gold who could unravel matter with a touch. They were not peerage pawns. They were his extensions of his will, unbound by evil pieces or contracts. Today they would prove why. Kazuki instructed everyone that this was not a sparring match and that they were to go all out, holding the line until he finished the blueprint. Issei Dahaka laughed like collapsing buildings and lunged. The battle erupted. Vera moved first. She slammed her blade into the ground and unleashed Prism Bastion, infinite refraction, causing thousands of mirror-like barriers to explode outward, each reflecting a different angle of reality. Issei's 1,000 arms smashed into them and were reflected back, claws tearing into his own form as dark energy burst outward. The evil dragon adapted instantly. The curses leapt toward the mirrors, seeking to turn them back against their creator. Kael countered by dissolving into a living storm and activating Tempest Overclock, Chain Lightning Singularity. He spiraled upward as bolts chained between Issei's heads, forcing them to reel. The dragon's corruption bled into the storm, destabilizing Kael's form and causing him to falter. Lyra stepped forward and initiated Entropic Cascade, Golden Unraveling. She pressed both hands to the ground and sent veins of molten gold racing outward, burrowing into Issei's scales. Matter began to unwind where the gold touched, weakening the dragon's defenses. One head showed severe damage before regenerative energies fought to repair it. But Issei Dahaka was no ordinary foe. He countered with the curse of the 1,000-fold agony, invisible waves that struck everyone's spirits at once, forcing visions of failure and loss to press in. Kazuki staggered under the weight of those images. Vera's armor cracked, Kael's storm faltered, and Lyra's golden veins dimmed. Kazuki gritted his teeth and pushed back. He raised both hands as Annihilation Maker flared, a golden-silver light that cut through the darkness. He thought that he did not need to kill the dragon outright, only to craft the right design. Inside his mind the blueprint formed. Phase 1, Resonance Anchor. He slammed his palm down and a massive circular array erupted beneath them, a glowing mandala of interlocking gears, circuits, and scale patterns resonating with the concept of evil dragon, drawing Issei's curses toward it like a magnet. The dragon snarled and pulled, but the array held. Phase 2. Inversion Core. Vera and Kael combined instinctively. Vera's prisms focused Kael's lightning into a single, blinding beam and fired it into the array. The energy inverted, and the mandala began to absorb Issei's power instead of being consumed by it. Issei roared in disbelief and lunged directly at Kazuki. Lyra intercepted with final design, golden guillotine, her arms elongating into massive golden blades that sliced through the attack. A head collapsed, only to begin regenerating as the dragon's curses worked to restore it. Kazuki activated Phase 3, Eclipse Protocol, and poured everything into the blueprint. The array collapsed inward, compressing into a fist-sized orb that hovered between him and the dragon. It pulsed twice and then detonated in a silent, colorless expansion. Architect's verdict: null cascade. The blast did not destroy in the usual sense. It unraveled Issei Dahaka's curses, dissolving the corrupting threads of his power. The dragon's many arms withered to smoke. Scales dissipated like dust. The three heads screamed as the fundamental layers of their existence were unmade, unraveling in a precise, metaphysical undoing. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then Issei reformed, smaller, wounded, furious but alive. He snarled that Kazuki had dared to unmake him and vowed to return with far more force. Kazuki dropped to one knee, breathing hard. His servants were battered, Vera's armor shattered, Kale barely holding form, Lyra's golden veins cracked. Yet they stood. Kazuki told them that they were not finished yet and that he could keep designing. He noted that the dragon was running out of curses. Issei Dahaka snarled as the lingering null effect frayed his form, and then dissolved into black mist, retreating into dimensional rifts. The array faded and silence returned. Kazuki looked at his servants. Vera offered a tired smile. Kale reformed and complained about needing a recharge. Lyra nodded with quiet pride. He exhaled and acknowledged that surviving was enough for today. Deep down, he knew the blueprint had worked, and that next time he would design something even stronger. The unclaimed path continued. Deep beneath the fractured dimensional layers, where the boundaries between worlds thinned to gossamer threads, the true heart of the Cow's Brigade, the Clippeth headquarters, pulsed like a malignant core. It was not a grand castle of obsidian spires or fiery pits. Instead, it was a labyrinthine void station, a colossal, inverted pyramid suspended in a pocket dimension of perpetual twilight. Walls of living shadow shifted with faint, whispering faces. Corridors twisted at impossible angles, lit only by the sickly green glow of stolen holy relics embedded like growths in the architecture. The air tasted of rust and despair. At the apex chamber, the inverted throne room, Reisavim Levon Lucifer lounged upon a seat carved from darkened remains of ancient dragons. His legs were crossed, one foot tapping the armrest. He wore his usual white suit, pristine despite the surrounding decay. In his lap rested a fragment of the Sephiroth Graal, its golden surface holding swirling, trapped essences. Reisavim stared into the fragment and smiled like a child who had just discovered a new toy. He thought the world had tried to bore him, but it no longer succeeded. He remembered being nothing once, a thinking object, a prince without a kingdom. He recalled his family's ambitions and found them pedestrian. He had wandered the underworld like a ghost, waiting for anything to make the centuries interesting. Reisavim reflected that Euclid had brought him gifts: Ophis Infinity, the Graal's life principles, whispers of another world beyond the dimensional gap, and finally the beast numbered 666. He regarded the arrival of Trihexa, the apocalypse beast sealed by ancient divinity with thousands of forbidden seals, as a thrilling challenge. He considered seals to be puzzles meant to be solved or broken. He imagined that with the Graal he could touch the concept of life, peel back layers of existence, and restore the evil dragons. Grendel's rage, Layden's malice, Yamada no Orochi and their kin had lingered as stubborn echoes. With the Graal's power he could revive them, stronger and freed from former weaknesses. They would serve as heralds, testaments to his influence. Reisavim turned his focus to Trihexa as the main event. He pictured the breaking of seals leading to a cataclysm that would engulf devils, angels, fallen, humans, dragons, and gods in sweeping chaos. When the world was reshaped by ash and ruin, he planned to stroll through the remains and perhaps cross into the other world Euclid had mentioned. If he died, he had prepared contingencies. His soul would act as a key to complete Trihexa's awakening. He envisioned his legacy not as domination or revenge but as relentless, beautiful collapse. He considered a new variable, the architect. Rise of him regarded Kazuki Sato as unclaimed, without peerage chains or a master, a pure, unbound creator thanks to his sacred gear, Annihilation Maker. He admired that Kazuki built servants from nothing, loyal and powerful without the taint of evil pieces or contracts, and that the boy fought with belief. Rise of him found it fascinating that even a three-headed monster like Issei Dahaka had fled from a boy and his handmaid servants. He laughed aloud and slapped his knee at the thought. Rise of him paced slowly as the shadows on the walls seemed to listen. He considered crushing Kazuki immediately, summoning Kuoh or Apophis to dismantle his creations, but he judged that too wasteful. Kazuki was more interesting alive. Rise of him preferred to let him grow, to attract attention, to become a beacon for every fool who believed they could resist chaos. When the time was right, he planned to take that power. He pictured fusing Annihilation Maker with the Graal to create forces beyond Trihexa. Legions of engineered nightmares, constructs tailored purely for destruction, without the limitations of resurrected souls. He identified Kazuki as someone who rejected the system, the peerage, and predictable alliances. He saw kinship in that defiance and resolved to show Kazuki a different kind of freedom, the freedom to watch everything burn. Rise of him sketched a long-term plan within his mind, patient and hidden even from his subordinates in Clippeth. First, continue the unsealing, using mass-produced evil dragons as provocations to test the world's defenses and exhaust those who oppose them. Second, monitor the architect closely. Euclid already had spies watching Kuoh's outskirts to report every new servant and technique. Third, isolate Kazuki, sow doubt among his allies, and make him question whether his creations were truly his or mere extensions of desperation. Fourth, when Trihexa rose and the world faltered, offer Kazuki a choice: join and lend his power, or refuse and have the sacred gear seized by force to be fused with the Graal, yielding creations that would eclipse even the evil dragons. He returned to the throne and settled with a contented sigh. For now, Rise of him would wait, watch, and smile. He believed everything eventually got claimed, and he believed chaos would prevail. Outside the chamber, unseen figures moved, loyal Clippeth agents, evil dragons in human guise, spies embedded in every faction. None of them knew the full extent of Rise of him's plans. Euclid did not know. Kuoh did not know. Not even the resurrected beasts themselves understood his deepest blueprint of ruin. Far away, in a battered industrial district, Kazuki Sato felt a chill he could not explain. The game had only just begun. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time Kazuki returned to Kuoh. The industrial district was kilometers behind him, but the phantom weight of Issei Dahaka's curses still clung to his shoulders like damp smoke. His uniform was torn in several places, Vera's prismatic shards still embedded in the fabric like broken glass stars, and a faint smudge on his upper lip showed where a curse wave had grazed him. He did not bother hiding it. He found Rias in the old school building's occult research club room, surprisingly alone. No peerage meeting tonight. She sat at the president's desk with a stack of paperwork she clearly was not reading, a single lamp casting warm light across her face while the rest of the room sank into comfortable shadow. Rias looked up as he opened the door. Her crimson eyes widened with concern and then narrowed with irritation before softening. She told him he was late and that he looked like he had fought a war. Kazuki shrugged, dropped into the nearest couch without ceremony, and said he had fought a dragon, which, in his words, was the same difference. Rias deliberately set the papers down and repeated that a dragon had attacked. Kazuki described it as an evil dragon, enormous and terrifying, a creature that brought chaos and curses. He added that Ophis had left right before the encounter. Rias pointed out how absurd it was that one of the legendary dragons had attacked him personally right after Ophis's departure and that he seemed to be treating it like a minor inconvenience. Kazuki met her gaze, flat and tired and unmistakably himself, and admitted that he had indeed fought it. Rias exhaled in the way people do when deciding whether to scold or sigh and demanded details. He gave them, in his clipped, almost bored tone, as though narrating the plot of a mediocre anime. He told her about Vera's infinite refraction fortress, Kael turning a storm into a plasma railgun, Lyra's golden unraveling eating through dragon scale like acid, the resonance anchor array he'd improvised on the fly, the inversion core, and the null cascade that had almost erased Azidahaka from existence. He omitted the parts that would have shown him weak, how the curse had come close to overwhelming him and how close he had been to losing consciousness. Some things were not worth mentioning. Rias was quiet for a long moment after he finished, then bluntly told him that he could have died. Kazuki dismissed it with a soft snort and a casual claim that he had not. Rias pinched the bridge of her nose and reminded him that he had faced one of the strongest evil dragons in recorded history, alone, with what he called his homemade familiars. Kazuki corrected her that they were not familiars but his, insisting there was a difference. Rias studied him like someone trying to solve a stubborn puzzle and told him he was impossible. Kazuki offered a faint, ghostly smirk in response. Rias shook her head with no real heat, just exhaustion and something close to fondness. She instructed him, quietly, to call for help next time, to call her before deciding to face an apocalypse-class monster alone. Kazuki admitted that calling for help was not his style. Rias, stepping closer so he could smell the faint rose scent of her hair, asked him to try anyway for her. He did not answer immediately, and after a pause, he muttered that maybe he would. Rias took that as the closest thing to a yes she would get, smiled small, tired, genuine and ruffled his already messy hair. She told him to go home and noted that he smelled of smoke and ozone. He stood, stretched until his spine popped, thanked her for worrying, and left before she could respond. The next afternoon was insistently ordinary. Kazuki had told his 3 servants in no uncertain terms that they were going out. No training, no experiments, no dimensional incursions, just normal. Vera tilted her head like a puzzled puppy. Kael muttered that normal was boring. Lyra smiled her enigmatic, molten gold smile and obeyed. They found a small cafe near the edge of town that specialized in ridiculously fluffy pancakes. Afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, and the other customers were mostly students and a couple of old ladies gossiping over tea. Kazuki sat at a corner booth in a plain black hoodie and jeans. Across from him were Vera in human disguise as a silver-haired beauty in a soft sweater dress, Kael in a leather jacket and ripped jeans, and Lyra in a flowing black and gold sundress that somehow made the entire cafe feel underdressed. They looked like the world's most unfairly attractive study group. The waitress nearly dropped the tray when she saw them. Towering pancakes arrived, drowned in whipped cream and dotted with strawberries. Vera stared at hers with cautious curiosity. Kael immediately began stealing bites from everyone else's. Lyra ate with serene poise, somehow not getting a speck of cream on her lips. Kazuki watched them, chin in hand, a tiny, almost invisible smile tugging at his mouth. Vera poked her pancake experimentally and asked whether it was really food. Kazuki explained that it was dessert pretending to be breakfast and urged her to eat before Kael stole the rest. Kael protested through a mouthful of stolen strawberry. Lyra observed that the sweetness felt like joy given physical form. Vera tried a bite and declared, with wide eyes, that it was illogical levels of pleasure. Kazuki welcomed her to humanity. They talked about nothing important. Vera wondered why humans put tiny umbrellas in drinks. Kael complained, half serious, that clouds were better company than people. Lyra quietly noted that the way sunlight moved across tabletops reminded her of molten gold flowing. Kazuki mostly listened. At one point Vera leaned over and wiped a tiny smudge of cream from the corner of Kazuki's mouth with her thumb, a casual, intimate gesture done without thinking. Kael pretended to GG and Lyra hid a smile behind her teacup. Kazuki did not pull away. Later they wandered to the nearby park in the late afternoon golden hour, passing kids running around, couples on benches, and an old man feeding pigeons. Vera chased a stray butterfly and laughed when it landed on her nose. Kael sat on the grass and tried, with little success, to shape tiny bolts of harmless lightning without startling anyone. Lyra walked beside Kazuki in comfortable silence, her arm occasionally brushing his. Kazuki glanced at her and remarked that she was quiet today. Lyra simply said she felt content and that she had not known creations could experience peace. Kazuki looked ahead at Vera chasing butterflies and Kale watching clouds and murmured agreement. The sun dipped lower. They stayed until the sky turned orange, then violet, then indigo. No dragons. No curses. No apocalypses waiting in the wings. Just 4 people, 3 of them born from imagination, and 1 who refused to be claimed, spending an ordinary afternoon together. For once, Kazuki did not feel like he had to build anything at all. Word traveled fast in the supernatural world, especially when it involved an evil dragon being forced to retreat. The fight in the abandoned industrial district had not gone unnoticed. Dimensional ripples from Issei Dahaka's arrival and withdrawal had been picked up by Grigori sensors, devil monitoring arrays, and opportunistic Yukai scouts. More than the raw energy signatures, it was the survivor reports that spread like wildfire through the underworld's noble houses, raiding game circuits, and the shadowed council chambers of the 4 great Satans. By the next evening, the name Kazuki Sato, the unclaimed human-wielding Annihilation Maker, was on more lips than it had been in the entire month since he had first appeared in Kuoh. Lucifuge household private study. Grafia Lucifuge stood motionless before a holographic projection of the battle site, arms folded and expression unreadable. Surzex Lucifer sat across from her, fingers steepled and a rare frown creasing his usually cheerful face. Grafia noted that the energy signature matched Issei Dahaka in full manifestation, 3 heads and the 1,000-arm curse form, and that the retreat vector indicated severe spiritual damage, not death, but enough to force dimensional withdrawal. Surzex exhaled slowly and asked about the human. Grafia explained that he had improvised a conceptual erasure array, inverting the dragon's own curses as fuel. She described the technique as innovative, unstable but effective, and added that he had created 3 entities on site that fought as extensions of his will. No summoning circles, no contracts, pure sacred gear manifestation. Surzex said that Ajuka would have a field day analyzing the recordings and reflected that Annihilation Maker had always been theoretical nightmare fuel, but Kazuki used it like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Grafia observed that he was rejecting every overture from the peerage system, even Rias's subtle invitations, and warned that if he continued growing unchecked it could complicate the balance of power. Surzex, smiling thin and tired, called the situation an opportunity rather than an immediate threat and ordered no interference, instructing Grafia to keep tabs and let the boy breathe. Grafia inclined her head in agreement. Inside, Surzex thought that a human who fought like that and walked away as if nothing had happened could shake the old order. Citri household war room. Sona Citri studied an encrypted report on her desk, the cold blue glow of her laptop reflecting off her glasses. She observed that an evil dragon had attacked singly and directly, and that the human had not merely survived but had repelled it. Tsubaki, standing at her shoulder, summarized the technique descriptions as disturbing matter unraveling, reality refraction, storm singularity, conceptual nullification, and warned that his creations were not familiars but autonomous, loyal, and frighteningly adaptive. Sona removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose, noting that he had told Rias he was fine in his usual tone, as if fighting an apocalyptic beast were equivalent to missing curfew. A small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. She admitted that she respected his competence. And a little, admired him. Sona ordered the Citri intelligence network to keep him under full observation with no engagement, and said that if the Cows Brigade targeted him again they would have to decide whose side they were truly on. Tsubaki bowed and acknowledged the order. Bale Household Grand Hall. Diehauser Belial, Emperor of Raiding Games, lounged on a velvet chaise with a glass of aged devil wine. Nobles around him murmured skepticism about a human with a Longinus defeating an evil dragon. Diehauser countered that underestimating the boy would be a mistake. He had seen the footage and knew the boy did not play by their rules. There was no peerage and no politics in his approach, just creation and destruction. Some nobles predicted burnout or defeat, but Diehauser chuckled and suggested that Kazuki Sato might change everything. He declared his desire to have eyes on the human, promising to take front-row seats if Kazuki ever entered a raiding game. Cows Brigade Outpost Hidden Report. A hooded figure knelt before a communication orb as Euclid Lucifuge's voice crackled through, calm and analytical. The agent confirmed the sighting and reported that Issei had retreated and that the architect's array had disrupted the dragon's curses at a fundamental level. Euclid said that his father would be intrigued and ordered continued surveillance with no engagement. The agent bowed. In the shadows, the distant echo of Rysavim's laughter lingered in the agent's mind, a reminder that a more patient predator still watched. Gremory Castle Private Chambers. Rias sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand. She had just hung up after another clipped conversation with Kazuki, during which he had insisted he was fine and told her to stop worrying. Her peerage had heard the rumors. Akino was quietly furious that someone had dared attack what she called her favorite stray. Kiba wore a thoughtful, sword-sharpening expression. Issei loudly declared his intention to punch the next dragon that appeared. Rias felt something deeper than that: pride, worry, and a growing certainty that the boy who refused every chain was becoming an independent force capable of standing against gods and monsters. She whispered to the empty room that he had better keep surviving, because she was not done trying to figure him out. Outside, the underworld's crimson moon hung low. Somewhere in the human world, in a quiet apartment, Kazuki slept exhausted, bruised, but unbroken while 3 ethereal figures stood watch over him. The ripples continued spreading. The underworld watched and waited. Grigori Observation Spire Ether 2. The Grigori's primary observation spire, codenamed Ether 9, floated in a stabilized pocket dimension just outside the dimensional gap's turbulence. From the outside it looked like a drifting shard of black crystal the size of a small skyscraper. Inside, it was a hive of methodical activity. Holographic arrays displayed thousands of simultaneous feeds. Analysts moved like silent ghosts between consoles, and monitoring arrays hummed, tuned to every frequency of supernatural energy. At the heart of the command deck stood Azazel, Governor-General of the Grigori, arms crossed and golden eyes fixed on the central holosphere. The projection displayed a looping reconstruction of the battle in the abandoned industrial district, each frame painstakingly rebuilt from residual dimensional echoes, sacred gear signatures, and curse residue. The reconstruction was disturbingly clear: 3 dragon heads roaring in perfect synchrony, 1,000 shadowy arms clawing at reality like tendrils of darkness, and at the center a human boy in a torn school uniform raising his hands as golden-silver light erupted around him like a newborn star. Azazel had not spoken for almost 10 minutes. Behind him, 2 of his most trusted lieutenants waited in respectful silence. Penemu, chief archivist and one of the oldest fallen angels still serving, adjusted his spectacles and noted that the array used at the end had no precedent. He explained that it was not destruction in the conventional sense but a form of conceptual subtraction. The boy had inverted Issei's curses and turned them into a recursive self-erasure protocol. Penemu added that the dragon had not fled because it was merely damaged. It had fled because continued existence in that localized space-time bubble had become mathematically impossible. Azazel whistled low and called the method nasty, beautifully nasty. Shemhazai, the Grigori's head of combat doctrine and tactical analysis, shifted his weight, his 6 black wings folded tight against his back in a rare sign of tension. He pointed out that the boy was human, 17, with no demonic contracts, no angelic blessings, and no divine artifacts beyond the Longinus itself. The fact that he had driven an evil dragon king to retreat on his own made the situation extraordinary. When Azazel asked if he had been entirely alone, Shemhazai explained that the boy had operated with 3 autonomous combat constructs of his own creation. They were not summoned beasts or familiars. They exhibited independent thought, emotional responses, and perfect synchronization with his intent. Shemhazai said the Grigori believed they were direct extensions of the boy's sacred gear imagination made manifest. A slow, dangerous grin spread across Azazel's face as he murmured that the Longinus called Annihilation Maker had always been terrifying on paper and that the paper had been underselling it. Penemu tapped a sequence into his tablet and overlaid a new layer on the holosphere showing energy readings from the fight. He pointed out that the signature of the creations did not draw from ambient magic, demonic power, or the dimensional gap itself. They were fueled exclusively by the boy's own life force and imagination. Penemu warned that such creations were sustainable, scalable, and, most concerning, potentially replicable. The boy survived long enough. He could theoretically create an army of loyal, adaptive beings that answered only to him. Azazel stared at the looping image of Kazuki dropping to one knee after the null cascade, breathing hard but still standing. He observed quietly that the boy had acted without asking for help, had not called Rias, had not signaled them, had not tried to run. Azazel remarked that the boy had built a solution on the spot and forced one of history's nastiest entities to withdraw. Shemhazai noted grimly that such independence was dangerous to everyone, including the boy himself. Azazel laughed short, sharp, genuine, and called the kid a walking paradigm shift. He then turned toward his lieutenants, his expression sobering as he pointed out what truly mattered. After fighting an evil dragon, the boy had gone on what appeared to be a mundane cafe outing with his creations the following day, eating pancakes, chasing butterflies, and behaving as if the world had not tried to swallow him less than 24 hours earlier. Penemu observed that that level of psychological resilience was statistically anomalous. Azazel countered that the boy might simply refuse to let the supernatural define his entire existence. Silence fell across the command deck as everyone absorbed that possibility. Azazel looked back at the holosphere, which had frozen on Kazuki's face right after the fight, exhausted and bruised, but with the faintest upward curve at the corner of his mouth as he looked at his three companions. When Azazel asked about options, Shemhazai answered that they should implement a full surveillance package, shadow teams on rotation, dimensional anchors at every location the boy frequented, and an attempt to recruit him before the Cow's Brigade could make another move. Penemu shook his head and rejected recruitment as likely to fail. He explained that every overture so far had been rebuffed politely but firmly, because the boy viewed the peerage system, the Grigori hierarchy, and even alliance structures as forms of claiming. He rejected being owned. Azazel nodded slowly and decided they would not recruit but protect quietly and deniably. He instructed his lieutenants to ensure the boy had breathing room to keep inventing if Rizavim or his agents came sniffing again, reasoning that if anyone could create something capable of standing against Trihexa when it woke, it was probably the boy. He added with a wry smile that if the boy ever wanted to talk about sacred gears, forbidden techniques, or how to make a dragon flee in fear, Azazel's door would be open. No contracts, no strings, just two peculiar individuals who liked building dangerous things. Shemhazai raised an eyebrow and questioned whether Azazel would let a 17-year-old human move about with that much power unsupervised. Azazel shrugged and replied that the boy had already proven he could handle himself better than many veteran agents. He concluded that sometimes the best thing for the world was to let the unclaimed remain unclaimed. The holosphere dimmed. Somewhere far below, in the human world, Kazuki Sato slept peacefully. Above him, unseen wings kept watch, not to control, not to claim, but to ensure the next impossible thing he built would have a chance to see daylight. In the deepest levels of Ether 9, the Grigori's floating fortress, Azazel stood alone in a sealed observation chamber known as the Eclipse Vault. No holographic displays cluttered the room, only a single massive crystal sphere pulsed with faint, multicolored light. Inside it, silhouettes flickered, dragon heads, monstrous limbs, and the endless cycle of regeneration that defined Trihexa. Azazel's golden eyes reflected the sphere's glow as he leaned against the railing, arms crossed, a half-smoked cigarette between his fingers. He had been sleeping poorly for weeks, ever since the first confirmed readings of Rizavim's unsealing rituals began spiking across every monitoring array. He thought that the boy had no idea how close they were to the endgame and admitted to himself that he did not fully know either. He tapped a sequence into the console beside him and brightened the sphere to project a detailed schematic of the isolation barrier field, a masterpiece of desperation disguised as genius. Azazel recalled that the project had begun as contingency planning years earlier, back when Rizavim first hinted about awakening the beast as if it were a dangerous hobby. Where laughter had once met that threat, now there was no laughter. Azazel had been the first to positively identify Trihexa's aura when it began stirring in Agrias. He had cross-referenced it with fragments from the Book of Revelation the Grigori had hoarded for millennia and found no doubt. This was power on par with Great Red and Prime Ophis. He knew that a single clash between them could rewrite the dimensional gap, and that killing Trihexa outright was out of the question. Sealing it was the only plausible option. Anything more was beyond their reach. Phase 2, Mitigation. Direct combat was suicide. Trihexa's regeneration shrugged off balance breakers, Longinus strikes, even super devil level output. Surzex had run the numbers, the combined might of the three factions' leaders, allied pantheons, and every willing god still left the task taking eons. Time the world did not have. So Azazel built something else. The isolation barrier field was a pocket dimension engineered from stolen raiding game arena tech, seraph-level celestial arrays, Beelzebub's forbidden dimensional equations, and every scrap of sealing magic the Grigori could scrounge from ancient texts. It was a self-sustaining prison where Trihexa's power would be constantly contested not by raw force, but by endless attrition. The key twist was that the barrier required living anchors. Powerful ones whose presence would suppress Trihexa's regeneration just enough to make the fight sustainable. Surzex, Michael, Odin, the heads of allied pantheons, and Azazel himself. They would step inside and seal the entrance as a one-way gate. Supplies could trickle in through micro-rifts, but escape would only be possible if Trihexa was neutralized first or if the anchors collectively decided the risk was worth it. A mutual pact of sacrifice wrapped in hope. Azazel smirked bitterly at the schematic. The estimate was thousands to tens of thousands of years, a never-ending war in a bottle. The world outside would keep spinning while they babysat the apocalypse. He had briefed the key players in fragments, never the full picture at once. Surzex knew his role. Michael had accepted with quiet grace. Odin had grumbled but agreed. Even Shiva had been approached. The destroyer would watch from outside, ready to intervene only if Trihexa ever breached another world. Phase 3, Wildcards. Azazel's true hope was not only in the barrier. It was in the next generation. Team DxD, the Longinus wielders. And especially anomalies like Kazuki Sato. The unclaimed architect had repelled an evil dragon king with improvised conceptual erasure, turning the creature's own malice into mathematical undoing. If anyone could innovate something new, a weapon, a seal, a counter that did not exist in any mythology, it was him. Azazel had quietly rerouted Grigori surveillance to prioritize the boy's development. No interference. Just observation and protection from the shadows. If the boy built something that could tip the scales, maybe they would not have to stay trapped forever. If not, at least the world would gain a few more decades of peace before the containment failed. He crushed a cigarette under his boot and turned away from the dimming sphere. Azazel muttered to the flickering image of Trihexa that he wanted to see how long it could keep regenerating when the strongest figures from every pantheon were forced to hold it at bay for eternity. He sealed the vault behind him as he left. Outside, the command deck hummed with activity. Penemu looked up and addressed him as governor. Azazel corrected him that he was former governor, the grin not reaching his eyes. He clapped Penemu on the shoulder and instructed him to keep the arrays active and to make sure he received any footage if the architect began developing anything new. As he headed for the exit, Azazel glanced back once at the closed vault door and reminded himself that the world had one hell of a backup plan. The Eclipse Vault had become Azazel's private hell. He returned to it almost every night now, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times when sleep refused to come. The crystal sphere still hung there, indifferent, its slow multicolored pulse the only heartbeat in the room. Trihexa's silhouettes moved inside like fish in polluted water, lazy, endless, inevitable. Azazel did not sit that night. He paced slow, deliberate circles around the sphere. Each step echoed louder than it should in the sealed chamber. His wings were half unfurled, black feathers rustling with every sharp turn, betraying the agitation behind the public smirk. He stopped directly in front of the crystal, close enough that his breath fogged the surface. He noted that the thing inside was not even fully awake yet, and it was already gaining the advantage. The truth had been gnawing at him for weeks, growing sharper with every new data packet from the monitoring arrays. The isolation barrier field was no longer simply a plan. It was a sentence. He had run projections alone the previous night, no lieutenants, no optimistic filters. The numbers had not improved. Best case, The combined power of the anchor team could suppress Trihexa's regeneration rate by roughly 87 to 92%. That left 8 to 13% unchecked. Over decades, that trickle would become an ocean. Over centuries, a flood. Over millennia, the barrier would fail. Not because they grew weak, but because the beast simply refused to stop growing stronger. Azazel pressed his palm flat against the crystal. It was unnaturally cold, like touching the skin of something already gone. He laughed once, a short, ugly sound that the echo mocked. Every time he replayed the footage of Kazuki Sato fighting Dahaka, the knot in his chest tightened another half-turn. The boy had improvised a conceptual erasure array in real time with 3 homemade companions who fought as if they had souls of their own. And yet he was still only 17, human, without immortality or divine protection. One bad day could end everything that made him special. Azazel's fingers curled against the crystal. If he pulled the boy in now, offering protection, resources, and a place at the table, the boy would likely walk away. If he waited and let the boy grow on his own, the boy might die before he was ready. If that happened, the isolation barrier would become permanent. No wild cards, no miracles, just the anchors locked in a bottle with the end of everything waiting in time. His wings snapped fully open in a sudden, violent motion that sent a gust through the chamber and fluttered papers on a console. The sphere's light flickered as if startled. Azazel admitted aloud that he had once thought himself the clever one who saw all the angles, built the toys, and laughed at the apocalypse because he had contingencies for contingencies. Now he was the one forced to decide how many people he was willing to consign to the prison so the rest of the world could get one more sunrise. Silence answered him. Then he conceded that he did not want to like the kid, not at all. It made everything harder. He did like him. He liked the stubborn refusal to be claimed, the pancakes and butterflies afternoons that followed dragon fights, and the terrifying, beautiful things he built out of sheer imagination. That knowledge made the calculus hurt worse. Azazel straightened, rolled his shoulders, and forced the smirk back onto his face, the same mask he'd worn for centuries that said nothing could touch him. He turned away from the sphere. Azazel addressed Trihexa's flickering form and warned it that if it wanted eternity, it would have to go through him first. He added that after him there was still a kid out there who believed he could unmake anything if he just drew the right blueprint. He walked to the vault door, paused, and looked back once. Azazel admitted that if the boy could not succeed, at least he would go down trying, which was more than most of them ever got. The door hissed shut behind him. In the empty vault, the sphere pulsed on slow, patient, eternal. Somewhere in the human world, under a quiet night sky, Kazuki Sato dreamed of new designs. Azazel carried the weight of both futures on his shoulders as he stepped into the corridor. For the first time in centuries, the Governor-General of the Fallen felt genuinely, achingly afraid not of Trihexa, but of the moment he might have to tell that stubborn, brilliant boy that freedom had a price, and that sometimes the price was paid in advance. In the inverted throne room of the Clippeth Pyramid, time moved differently. Not because of any spatial distortion or dimensional trickery, those were cheap parlor games even the lowliest Clippeth grunts could manage. Time stretched here because Rizavim Levon Lucifer willed it so. He sat cross-legged on the blackened bone throne, one elbow propped on the armrest, chin resting lazily in his palm. In his other hand floated the Sephiroth Graal fragment, no longer a mere shard, but a slowly rotating orb the size of a grapefruit, its surface threaded with faint, golden strands of captured life force. Every few seconds a muted cry would ripple through it, too faint for mortal ears, and Rizavim never tired of the sound. He was smiling. Not the manic, toothy grin he used to make people squirm, but a smaller, softer smile, almost tender, the kind of smile reserved for someone watching the last candle burn down to the wick and savoring every millimeter of wax it had left to give. They think they're racing against time, he thought, considering Surzex with his noble sacrifices, Azazel with his tidy doomsday project, Michael with his prayers, and even that stubborn boy the architect scribbling new blueprints in the dark, convinced each one brought him closer to safety. They all believed the clock ticked downward. Rizavim watched a single golden strand inside the orb fray and reform, satisfied. He had stopped rushing months ago. The initial excitement resurrecting Grendel, letting Apophis rend the sky, watching Krumkrutch effortlessly rout squads of exorcists out of boredom had been entertaining, a lively opening act. But true chaos, he had learned, was found in the long, slow unraveling. He could unseal Trihexa tomorrow if he wanted a single, decisive ritual, one final infusion of the Graal's stolen life principles into the deepest seal. The beast would wake, the world would burn in days, and then there would be silence, ash, and boredom. Ryzavim wanted the prelude to last. He wanted Team DxD to exhaust themselves chasing shadows. He wanted the underworld nobles to fracture under the weight of endless small crises. He wanted Azazel to spend sleepless nights staring into that ridiculous crystal prison he was building, calculating probabilities that would never save him. He wanted Surzex to look at his little sister and wonder for a heartbeat if protecting the world meant sacrificing her future. He wanted Michael to pray harder, knowing the prayers were being answered by nothing but empty air. Most delicious of all, he wanted Kazuki Sato to keep building. Every new servant the boy created would be another thread Ryzavim could tug later. Every impossible technique he improvised would be another toy Ryzavim could steal when the time came. Every time the boy refused to join a faction or walked away from offers of power or protection, he only made the eventual claiming sweeter. Ryzavim leaned forward slightly, eyes half-lidded with pleasure. He encouraged the boy to grow attached to his creations and to let those bonds become his reason to keep fighting. The thought of reaching out then did not feel like malice so much as the private joy of a collector who had waited years for the perfect specimen. He imagined not only taking the boy's sacred gear but also taking the look on his face when he realized that every creation he had made and every bond he had allowed himself to feel had become part of the final pattern. That hatred, Ryzavim mused, would be the sweetest note in his symphony. He waved a hand. The Graal orb dimmed and floated to rest on a velvet cushion beside the throne. There was no hurry. The seals were degrading on their own schedule now, slow and inevitable like ice melting in a warm room. Each tiny fracture sent fresh ripples through the factions, breeding fear, desperation, and exquisitely tense complications. Ryzavim stretched like a cat in sunlight and let them hope, plan, and cling to the illusion that they controlled the pace. He rose and walked to the edge of the chamber where the void stretched out like black velvet. Somewhere far below, in layers of shadow, his agents continued their work patient, methodical, and never rushed. When Trihexa finally woke, he believed it would not be an apocalypse but relief, the long, agonizing waiting finally over. He turned his face upward toward the unseen ceiling of the inverted pyramid and whispered into the emptiness that everyone should take their time, because he was enjoying the show. Somewhere in the human world, Kazuki Sato woke from a dream he could not quite remember, something about golden threads pulling at invisible strings. He shook it off, went to school, ate lunch with people who did not know him, and built another small, improbable thing in the quiet hours after midnight. Ryzavim, countless dimensions away, smiled wider. Every ordinary day the boy lived stretched. The tension further and further until something inevitably snapped. In a sealed sublayer beneath the Qliphoth pyramid, a place even most Qliphoth commanders did not know existed, the hero faction leadership met in near total darkness. There was no grand table or banners, only 5 figures standing in a loose circle around a single low-burning violet flame that gave off no heat. The flame's light caught only fragments. A white cloak, a silver mask, a pair of crossed spears leaning against a wall, the dull gleam of a sacred sword hilt, and the faint outline of a woman whose eyes reflected the fire like twin amethysts. Chow Chow stood at the center with hands clasped behind his back and a relaxed posture that made the others instinctively tense. George Faust, wielder of Dimension Lost, was the first to break the silence, asking whether waiting remained the correct course given that the boy had already repelled Azidahaka and continued to grow at an exponential rate. Chow Chow raised a single finger, the room stilled at the small motion. He then asked George to tell him what would happen if they approached the boy that day. George adjusted his glasses and explained that, if they offered an alliance and presented themselves as fellow unclaimed forces aiming to dismantle the current supernatural order, logic suggested the boy should reject peerages, devil politics and angelic oversight, but that he might also reject them for the same reason, since any banner was still a banner. Heracles snorted from the shadows, arms crossed over his massive chest, and demanded to know what they planned to do about that. Cao Cao smiled thinly and said that the kid was strong, but still only one person supported by 3 companions. They could ambush him, seize the Longinus by force, and be done. He allowed the idea to hang in the air before continuing. Cao Cao explained that a stolen Annihilation Maker would not simply obey a new wielder, and that a sacred gear that answered only to imagination and would take months or years to control. He said that in that time the boy would either fade away quietly or survive, and that in either case they would lose the one element that could make their victory meaningful. Leonardo, the youngest and the creator of the anti-monster weapons, said in a soft voice that Cao Cao wanted the boy to come to them. Cao Cao corrected him, saying he wanted the boy to come to something, not necessarily to them not yet. He began to walk slowly around the violet flame, each step deliberate, and gestured toward the empty air. Illusory images flickered into existence above the flame, ghostly projections of the major players. Cao Cao described the board as it stood. He noted that Rizavim was playing the patient spider, letting tension build until it snapped. Azazel was building a doomsday cage he expected to fail eventually. Surzex and Michael were holding the world together with prayers and politics. And Kazuki Sato, the boy, kept refusing every hand extended to him. He built, he fought, he returned to ordinary life. Each time he survived another impossible battle, the fear in every faction grew. The illusion shifted to show tiny figures representing underworld nobles, Grigori analysts, and the Gremory peerage, all glancing over their shoulders and waiting for the next strike. Cao Cao lowered his voice and said that fear was fertilizer. The more they feared the unknown power the boy represented, the more tightly they gripped one another. Alliances would strain, trust would erode, old grudges would resurface. While the factions tore at each other trying to decide whether the architect was a threat to be crushed, contained, or recruited, Cao Cao said they would wait. He smiled, sharp and almost boyish, and said that every day the boy remained unclaimed was another crack in the foundation of the current order. Rizavim could have his slow poison. Azazel could waste decades on a prison that would never hold. Devils and angels could choke on their own paranoia. When the tension finally became unbearable and they could no longer treat the boy as just another Longinus wielder, mistakes would be made, desperate offers, assassination attempts, forced recruitment, and attempts to seal him away for the greater good. Each mistake would drive the boy further from them. Cao Cao explained that when the boy had nowhere left to turn and every faction had proven they would try to claim him one way or another, then he would look for the one group that had never approached him, never demanded his loyalty, and never tried to leash his power. George exhaled slowly and said they would be waiting not as saviors or conquerors, but as the only ones who had respected his refusal to be owned. Cao Cao nodded in agreement. The violet flame flared brighter for a heartbeat, then settled. Heracles cracked his knuckles and asked if they were simply going to sit and watch the world go insane around the boy. Cao Cao replied calmly that they would not sit, they would watch, prepare, and let the boy's stubborn freedom do the real work for them. Far above them in the human world, Kazuki Sato sat on the roof of his apartment building staring at the stars while 3 quiet companions kept him company. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, a feeling he had grown used to, but he still refused to look for their owners. 5 figures in a dark room smiled because that refusal was exactly what they needed. The longer he remained free, the sweeter the eventual breaking point would be. The old Kuoh harbor had become a graveyard of steel and salt. Twisted cranes leaned like drunken giants and their shadows bled into a thick fog rolling off the black water. Somewhere in that mist, the air began to burn. Valthor the Inevitable stepped forward. Once a fallen angel of middling rank, he had grown in power through relics taken from underworld vaults and fragments of divine weapons that now melded to his form. His 12 wings were jagged sheets of dark metal and his armor shimmered with unstable light. In his grip burned a spear that seemed to draw color from the world around it. He had come to claim the architect's creations and to take their power for himself. For servants emerged from the fog as if part of it. Celine moved first, tall, silver-haired, wrapped in flowing midnight silk that caught no light, her face calm and almost amused as if watching a predictable but entertaining play. Verna followed, a walking fortress of basalt and molten veins, broad-shouldered and deliberate. Her amber eyes held patient certainty. Lyra slipped in next, lean and dangerous, her obsidian hair pulled back tight and a grin that suggested she was ready to ruin someone's day. Twin curved blades rested in her hands. Ilara brought up the rear, ethereal, platinum-haired, robes shimmering like starlight, speaking seldom but with the weight of something ancient and final. They formed a loose circle around Valthor without speeches, simply predators sizing up their opponent. Valthor laughed, a metallic sound, and declared that they were toys without strings and that he would enjoy overwhelming them. Selene tilted her head and noted almost conversationally that they had been busy and that their master was not the only one who had been getting sharper. Valthor lunged and his spear erupted in a lance of destructive energy, black fire and shattered light surging toward Selene. She did not flinch. One elegant hand rose and a wall of compressive force slammed into the attack, folding the assault inward like paper. The backlash struck Valthor and staggered him back. Verna was already moving. She closed the distance in earth-shaking strides and struck him with a heavy gauntlet blow that sent him reeling. The impact rang like a cathedral bell. Armor plates buckled and the force shuddered through the pier. Valthor unleashed a spray of shadowed essence and swung his spear in a wide, brutal arc. Lyra laughed bright and vicious and slipped inside the swing. Her blades flashed twice and scored clean, stylized strikes across his forearm and thigh, slicing through plated defenses with practiced ease. The hits flared briefly and left him staggered. She twisted away before he could retaliate, already circling for the next opening. Lyra taunted that he had big wings and a big mouth but a small brain as she spun one blade on her finger. Valthor roared and detonated his wings into a storm of razor-edged feathers. Thousands of metallic shards exploded outward, shredding the fog and turning the air into a hazard of whistling blades. Ilara raised her staff and snapped a dome of pale starlight into place around the four of them. The feathers struck the barrier and simply stopped. Their momentum bled away and the metal crumbled into harmless fragments. Ilara regarded Valthor with quiet disappointment and murmured that he was loud but not clever. Verna seized the moment. She charged through the fading barrier, seized one wing joint, and hurled him sideways into a rusted shipping container. The metal buckled. He surged back out almost immediately, spear blazing, and moved toward Verna's chest. Selene intercepted with calm precision. She caught the between two fingers and twisted until the weapon began to unravel. With a casual gesture she sent a concentrated pulse of kinetic force that hammered Valthor backward, denting his breastplate and sending him skidding across the pier. Lyra was on him before he could recover. She vaulted onto his back and landed precise, disabling strikes along vulnerable seams, forcing him to thrash uselessly. When he threw her off she landed lightly, grinning, a faint smear marking her cheek like a badge of the fight. Lyra remarked that he was slowing down and seemed tired already. Valthor's halo flared in a last, desperate surge. A corrupted nova of light erupted and scorched the wooden dock, forcing even Verna to brace an arm across her face against the glare. Ilara stepped forward through the haze. Her staff pulsed and a lance of pure white energy punched through Valthor's halo. The crown of light shattered like glass and his stolen power began to unravel, spilling out in wild, uncontrolled bursts. Verna closed the distance again and, without killing him, wrapped both massive hands around his throat to hold him still. Selene advanced slowly, her robes untouched by ash, and placed one hand against the dented chest plate. She observed that they had been busy, softer this time, almost kind. Lyra took her place beside Selene and twirled a blade with casual ease, declaring that Valthor was just another lesson. Ilara drove her staff forward once more and white energy flooded through Valthor like concentrated starfire. The stolen relics flared and fell away one by one, wings folded, armor unlatched, and the spear in his hand crumbled into ash. When the light faded, only a wisp of shadow remained. It unraveled and blew away on the harbor wind. Silence settled. The fog crept back in, swallowing scorch marks. Lyra flicked her blades shut and sheathed them with a satisfied sigh, remarking that the fight had been almost a workout. Verna exhaled and rolled her shoulders, judging the structural damage acceptable. Illara lowered her staff as the constellations on her robes dimmed and noted that it had been done cleanly. Celine looked up toward the dark distance where the architect watched and allowed a small, genuine smile. She told the architect that they were ready for the next one. One by one they faded silver, basalt, shadow, starlight dissolving back into waiting potential, sharper and hungrier than before. The harbor lights flickered back to life. Nothing had happened here tonight. Except everything. The little cafe tucked behind Kuoh's old shopping district was half empty at that hour. Warm amber lights spilled across wooden tables, jazz drifted low from hidden speakers, and the smell of fresh ground coffee mixed with cinnamon rolls. The night was ordinary again, cars passing, streetlights buzzing, no trace of scorched docks or vanished fallen creatures. Inside, 4 women occupied the corner booth like they owned it. Celine sat against the window in a simple charcoal turtleneck and high-waisted black trousers, silver hair loose and tucked behind one ear, cradling a flat white in both hands and watching the steam curl upward. Verna took up most of the bench opposite in a dark bomber jacket over a fitted gray tee, sleeves pushed to her elbows, forearms still faintly dusted with basalt flecks. She had a black coffee and a plate of 3 untouched croissants. Lyra sprawled beside her, legs kicked up on the opposite bench, wearing ripped black jeans, a cropped leather jacket over a loose band tee, and combat boots she hadn't bothered to lace properly. Her iced latte was already half gone and condensation dripped onto the table as she twirled a sugar packet between her fingers. Illara sat primly at the end, platinum hair braided over one shoulder, dressed in a soft cream sweater and wide-leg linen pants. Her chamomile tea steamed untouched while she traced constellations on the fogged window with a fingertip. For a long minute none of them spoke. The only sound was the clink of Celine's spoon against porcelain. Then Lyra snorted and scoffed that a middling fallen like Valthor, someone who couldn't have matched the cadre 10 years ago, suddenly walking around with enough power to make his wings ring like struck steel didn't just happen. Verna grunted, finally tearing off a corner of a croissant, and observed that stolen relics didn't explain the density. It felt like he was carrying the weight of entire pantheons. Celine took a slow sip, eyes half-lidded, and noted that she hadn't tasted 3 pantheons but 1, Hindu. She detected Indra's signature in the backlash, sharp, electric, arrogant, like lightning that still believed it was supposed to rule. Illara paused with her finger on the glass and repeated the name Indra softly, noting that he had been unusually quiet since the last raiding game season. Lyra leaned forward, elbows on the table and a grin on her face, joking that the god of thunder must have gotten bored playing King of the Gods and decided to run a science project fusing old toys with dragon flesh and sacred gears to see what would stick. Verna replied flatly that Valthor hadn't been the endgame but a prototype, disposable if it worked for Indra, something even Azura might struggle against. Celine set her cup down with a soft click and said that the relics hadn't just been grafted, they had been woven. Illara explained that Hindu divine weapons Vajra fragments, possibly pieces of the original Thunderbolt, had been threaded through dragon tissue and fused to sacred gear cores, using the Fallen's own light as the binding agent. It was crude but effective, and he had lasted longer than expected. Lyra whistled low and observed that dragon flesh accounted for the regeneration factor, so the Fallen had kept coming back from hits that should have ended him. She added that the sacred gear mimicry made it clear the spear had been borrowed rather than his own. Illara lifted her tea and cradled it close, saying the Chaos Brigade's fingerprints were all over the technique. They had been collecting dragon parts for years, Vala's faction especially. Indra could have made a quiet deal, provide Hindu artifacts they could not obtain elsewhere, and in return they supplied test subjects and the fusion know-how. Verna narrowed her eyes and pointed out that the goal had always been Azura. She said Indra had never liked sharing the top of the food chain since the Vedic days. If he could forge soldiers that matched or exceeded Azura's destructive output without divine approval or heavenly politics, he would rewrite the Pantheon's balance of power. Lyra laughed, short and bright, and compared Indra's plan to a sibling wanting a pet valley. She said it was bold and foolish trying to mass-produce that kind of power. Celine watched the window, reflections of passing headlights sliding across her face, and warned that it was not mass production yet. She explained that Valthor had been a proof of concept. If the fusion held up under real combat stress against opponents like them, the next batch would be refined, cleaner, stronger, and less likely to burn out after minutes in a fight. Illara set her cup down without drinking and said he would need more fallen volunteers or unwilling ones, and more dragon material. She added that he would start hunting again younger dragons, rogue ones, or worse if he grew desperate. Verna cracked her knuckles deliberately and told them to let him try. They would be waiting. Lyra kicked her boots off the bench, stretched, and insisted that next time she wanted the prototype with actual style rather than noise and no flair. Celine's lips curved slightly as she cautioned Lyra to be careful. A comfortable quiet settled. The jazz track changed to something slower and smokier, and the city outside moved on oblivious. Illara murmured that their master should be informed. Celine nodded and confirmed that he already knew. Lyra raised her nearly empty latte in a mock toast to middling fallen angels who bit off more than they could chew and to the man about to learn what happens when his science project met the real thing. They clinked ceramic against paper and empty air, then fell back into easy silence, four predators in civilian clothes sipping drinks and plotting the next move. The night outside was calm. Inside the booth, the architecture kept evolving. News of Rias's hard-fought victory over Riser won by the hidden potential of Issei's boosted gear, not by any outside aid, reached Kazuki indirectly. He felt a flicker of respect. She had proven her worth, just as he had coldly advised. It changed nothing between them. The ORC now treated him with icy, formal disdain, a state he preferred to their earlier attempts at recruitment. His focus was on expansion. He created his third servant, Lydia, a bishop of immense magical capacity. She was serene, with long silver hair and sage-green eyes, clad in robes patterned like woven starlight, specializing in barrier magic and energy manipulation. He was training with his trio, Celine directing strategy, Scat-Hack testing combat limits, Lydia fortifying their space when Celine's head snapped up. Celine informed him that a powerful, chaotic divine signature had appeared at the southern edge of the city. She described it as hungry and malignant, and not a sanctioned entity. Celine identified it as a rogue god, a minor deity from a forgotten pantheon, likely cast out or gone mad, seeking worship and power through terror. Exactly the kind of threat the ORC or Citri group would mobilize to contain. Celine confirmed that the Gremory and Citri peerages were mobilizing but were minutes away, and she warned that the deity was manifesting near a populated shrine and that casualties would be high. Kazuki sighed. This was the burden of power. He wanted freedom, not anarchy. He wanted no masters, but that did not mean he would tolerate wanton destruction in the city he had chosen for his sanctuary. Kazuki decided they would handle it, not for the peerages but for the people who lived there and to send a message. They arrived in a flash of shadow walk, a technique of Celine's creation. The scene was apocalyptic. A massive, multi-armed entity of stone and gnarled wood, radiating corrupt divine energy, was tearing through the shrine grounds. Its roar hit like a shockwave and shattered stone lanterns. A few shrine attendants were trapped, cowering. The ORC arrived from the opposite direction just as Kazuki acted. Kazuki ordered Lydia to contain the area and extract the civilians. Lydia raised her hands, and silent, immense barriers of glowing green energy erupted. They shielded the civilians and formed delicate, telekinetic hands that lifted them to safety seamlessly. Kazuki instructed Scat-Hack to degrade and harass the entity. Scat-Hack launched forward in a blur of crimson. Her strikes did not aim to maim. They disrupted the divine energy coalescing around the deity's limbs, causing it to reel and lose its composure. The god refocused its power and gathered a massive ball of corrupt light to retaliate. Kazuki then called for Celine to finish it. Celine stepped forward, her glasses catching the dim light, and opened a small, precise portal of absolute shadow inside the deity's spiritual core. Rather than sending a projectile through, she pulled. The god's roar cut off. Its form shuddered violently as its essence was unmade and drawn into the consuming void of Celine's shadow. Within moments, The massive shape collapsed into inert stone and weathered wood, its malignant presence utterly erased. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. It was a flawless, awe-inspiring display of coordinated, overwhelming power. Kazuki stood, with his hands in his pockets as Celine, Scathach, and Lydia returned to his side, unscathed and composed. The ORC stood frozen at the edge of the destroyed grounds, reduced to spectators. Issei stared open-mouthed. Kiba looked defeated. Akino went pale. Rias's expression was unreadable, a storm of awe, resentment, and dawning horror. Kazuki met Rias's gaze across the rubble, gave a small, impersonal nod, and then turned. His group melted back into the gathering twilight shadows, leaving no trace but the remains of a dead god. He had not helped her. He had handled his problem. The message was clear. The free spirit was not just independent. He was a self-contained force of nature, a sovereign power operating under his own law. He judged threats by his own metrics and answered to no one.